some of you are going to go. Anybody going? And it's going to be very interesting. We're going to meet with a lot of the foreign leaders they want to meet.
Trump can't force a global decoupling from China. Can one country force the entire world to break up with China? That seems to be Donald Trump's bet. But if that's truly the goal of his trade war, it's a gamble that could backfire badly. Right now, there's no clear signal about what the United States actually wants when it comes to trade. Tariffs appear and disappear with little warning. President Trump's own positions seem to shift by the day. His officials are left scrambling to explain the logic behind his sudden moves, and more often than not, they fail. In the middle of all this chaos, one nation thinks it's figured out what the U.S. is trying to do. On April 21st, China's Commerce Ministry issued a warning to other countries. Don't sign trade deals with the U.S. that could harm Chinese interests. If Beijing is right, and Trump is indeed trying to force a global decoupling from China, then this strategy is not only risky, it could blow up in Washington's face in three major ways. First, let's explore why the theory of a U.S.-led decoupling makes sense. Currently, only Chinese goods face punishing U.S. tariffs, some as high as 145%. Meanwhile, Trump's threats of reciprocal tariffs against other countries are on hold. That suggests a larger plan. Washington may be pressuring other governments to follow suit, blocking Chinese imports or else facing U.S. tariffs after a 90-day grace period. Trump officials haven't denied this interpretation either. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently claimed that once the U.S. and its allies agree on economic terms, they can approach China as a group. But here's the problem. This approach could hurt the U.S. more than it hurts China. According to the International Monetary Fund, trade wars will reduce U.S. GDP growth by 0.9 percentage points this year. China? Only 0.6 percentage points. And the math behind this is simple. In 2024, the U.S. imported $439 billion worth of Chinese goods, more than triple the amount China bought from the U.S. So American companies will end up paying far more in tariffs than their Chinese counterparts. Beyond that, the nature of the goods matters. China supplies around 75% of certain electronics that the U.S. imports, smartphones, monitors, and other high-tech items that are tough to replace. With no local production ready to scale up and few alternatives globally, prices for U.S. consumers are going to spike. China, on the other hand, mostly imports basic goods from the U.S., like soybeans and oil, items it can easily buy elsewhere. And China holds other cards too. If Beijing really wants to strike back, it can weaponize critical resources. Pharmaceuticals are one area of concern. Chinese companies produce almost half of the world's ingredients for antibiotic drugs. But the bigger concern? Rare earth elements. These are 17 metals essential for electric vehicles, defense systems, and digital tech. In April, China made a move. It started requiring export permits for 7 of these rare earths destined for the U.S. Since China controls 90% of global rare earth processing capacity, the decision triggered panic in supply chains worldwide. Even small delays in issuing export permits could have global consequences. 2 of the affected metals, dysprosium and terbium, are key for making EV motors and jet engines. And finding substitutes isn't easy. That's the first flaw in Trump's strategy. The U.S. might suffer more than China. Now let's look at the second issue, forming a global coalition. Would other countries actually join the U.S. in isolating China? Europe is the biggest swing region here, and recent developments suggest U.S. decoupling hopes are fading fast in Brussels. European leaders are focused more on Trump than China. His unpredictability eats up time and political energy. As a result, de-risking from China is no longer a top priority for the EU. There are signs of a warming relationship between Europe and Beijing. In April, the European Commission agreed to reopen talks with China about tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, one of the most sensitive topics between the two sides. Despite U.S. warnings, including Besant's comment that Europe would be cutting its own throat by getting close to China, EU leaders are moving in the opposite direction. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently spoke with Chinese Premier Li Qiang, and their discussion ended with an agreement to hold a major EU-China summit in Beijing this July. That summit will likely produce big headlines, perhaps new Chinese investment in Europe in exchange for tariff relief. Even EU member states are signaling support. Before heading to Beijing, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez called for a full review of the EU's China policy, a clear pushback against US pressure. China, meanwhile, is playing its cards wisely. It's preparing to lift sanctions it imposed in 2021 on 5 EU lawmakers, removing a major obstacle to any formal EU-China deal. And it's not just Europe. Around the world, most countries rely heavily on trade with China. Beijing is their biggest trading partner, and cutting ties would come at a steep cost. China's global influence isn't limited to trade either. Yes, US firms still top the charts in foreign direct investment, with $404 billion in 2023, but Chinese companies invested $148 billion abroad last year, on par with Japan and the EU. So what's the logical move for most countries? Stay neutral. Keep ties with both the US and China. Offer Trump symbolic concessions that sound big but don't really change much. Japan is already doing this, planning minor tweaks to its car safety standards just to keep Trump happy. He's long complained about Japanese and EU car regulations, even though most of his claims are factually incorrect. And that brings us to the third, and perhaps biggest, flaw in this decoupling plan. Why would anyone ditch China when Trump's offer isn't even clear? Many US allies say they now see Washington, not Beijing, as the world's biggest geopolitical risk. Trump's inflammatory statements haven't helped. He's claimed the EU was formed just to screw the United States. He once floated the idea of seizing Greenland, which would have sparked a NATO crisis. And his disastrous Oval Office meeting with Ukraine's President Zelensky in February left many allies wondering if they can trust anything Trump says or agrees to. With credibility collapsing, many countries now see aligning with the US as politically dangerous. And with no clear or consistent trade offer from Washington, the incentive to break from China just isn't there. Trump may want to force the world into choosing sides. But when the cost of decoupling is high, and US leadership looks unstable, don't be surprised if the world says, no thanks. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.